I will switch to English for the second panel of the second day of our symposium. All our panelists are present, so we can start with just 2 minutes later than planned. The next panel will be on the question, how to deal with colonial street names, and we have 3 case studies, Salaam, Erfurt, and Hamburg. The discussion will be chaired by Bebero Lehmann. Bebero Lehmann is a historian and journalist who recently worked at DOMIT, Documentation Center and Museum for Migration in Germany in Cologne, and also offers colonial critical city tours in Cologne's Afrika Viertel. I now hand over to you, Bebero. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you very much, Gisela, for this introduction. I'd like to say a few more words on what this panel is about, and afterwards I will present or introduce all 3 panelists to you first. Then we will hear their presentation, and afterwards we will have some time for a hopefully lively discussion. Okay. So as Gisela already said, this panel is about how to deal with colonial street names in different cities. We have 3 case studies, and we will see what we can also learn from this. And we will also investigate how these street names contribute to a certain culture of remembrance, and discuss how eventual renaming these street names is a crucial part in order to decolonize not just the public spaces, but also our culture of remembrance. So I will present the panelists in the order in which they will give their presentations. So I will go first with Reginald Kirey. He's a researcher from Tanzania, and he used to be an assistant lecturer at the Department of History of the University of Dar es Salaam, and currently he's doing his PhD in Hamburg on collective memories of German colonialism in Tanzania. And he is at Hamburg's Research Center on Post-Colonial Legacy. He also published on representation of colonial heroes in Germany, Tanzania, and British remembrance culture. And today in his presentation, he will give us some insights on the politics of naming and renaming street names in Dar es Salaam. Okay, then I'd like to introduce Urs Lindner. He is currently a research associate at the Max-Weber-Kolleg at the University of Erfurt, and he is currently doing his habilitation on the egalitarian justification of affirmative justice. And before that, he concluded his PhD on Marx and philosophy. Furthermore, Urs Lindner is also active at the initiative Decolonize Erfurt. And Decolonize Erfurt is currently very engaged in renaming the Nettelbeckufer to Gerd-Schramm-Ufer. And besides that, Decolonize Erfurt offers city tours. They offer workshops in schools. They curated an exhibition already on the colonial past of Erfurt, and they will soon release a digital archive on the colonial past of the city Erfurt. And in his presentation today, Urs Lindner will tell us some more about the way colonial street names are dealt with in Erfurt. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Sebastian Todzi. He is a scientific coordinator at the Research Center Hamburg's post-colonial heritage, so to say, and Hamburg and the early globalization at the University of Hamburg. and he just finished his PhD on the Lehmann Company and colonialism. In October, the book Hamburg, Tor zur kolonialen Welt, Erinnerungsorte der postkolonialen Globalisierung, will be published, and he edited this book together with Professor Jürgen Zimmerer. And today he will talk to us about discourses on colonial street names in Hamburg. So before you start with your presentation, which will be 15 to 20 minutes so that we still have some time to discuss, I'd like to quickly explain the procedure afterwards. So the audience will be able to ask questions just by typing the questions in the chat. And I'd also like to welcome you, the panelists, to ask questions to each other as well. So thank you very much for being here with us today. And please, Reginald, Kirey, start with your presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Bebero, for the introduction. I hope you can see my slides. Do you? Thank you very much. For inviting me on this very important discussion on symposium on colonial streets in Hamburg. And I'm here today to share with you this topic for the case of Dar es Salaam. And my topic is on from Kaiser Strasse to City Drive. The focus is on the politics of naming and renaming streets in Dar es Salaam.
Dear Mr. Kirey, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We can see your presentation, but not in full screen mode. If you want to presentate the mode, please click yes. on from beginning.
Oh, yeah. Okay, can you see the slides now?
Wonderful, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to present on the from Kaiser Strasse to the City Drive, the politics of naming and renaming streets in Dar es Salaam. Now, this is the map of Dar es Salaam for those who do not know this region, which is in East Africa, and of course, which was part of huge Dutch East Africa or German East Africa, and today we call it Tanzania. So you can see we have this region, which I'm focusing on, and which is Dar es Salaam. Very small one, the smallest region, of course. So this is the town which I'm going to focus on, and the discussion will be based on this geographical region of Tanzania. Now, on background, sorry. I'm going to look at, for example, the history of this region when it started. I mean, of history of colonialism in East Africa, especially in Dar es Salaam. That the Germans, as we know, in the late 19th century, they established their imperial presence in East Africa. And they established their capital city in Dar es Salaam. Of course, before that, it was Bagamoyo, but later they shifted it to Dar es Salaam. So when you talk of the street patterns of the city center of Dar es Salaam as they are today, you are actually talking of the streets which have been there since German colonial period, because they have not changed at all. So now, because the Germans established in Dar es Salaam as their capital, they designed different streets. And of course, they named these streets in different German names. And most of these were names of German colonial officials. Now, during the First World War, as we know, German was, defeated by British and Belgian forces, and Dar es Salaam became under the British during the what we call the Mandate period. And because you have this political transfer from German colonial rule to British colonial rule, now the British changed almost all the names, the street names which existed in Dar es Salaam by then. And of course, the reasons are obvious, as we are going to discuss that one. And the British did that during this period of 1919 to 1960. That means after the end of the Second World War. And then the British, like I said, they changed the street names, as we are going to say, and they controlled Tanzania until 1961, when the country got independence. And of course, steps were taken by the independent government of Tanzania to change the street names of Dar es Salaam. And we are going to see how that happened and why the government had to do that. In October, officially in October 1920, British renamed all streets, like I've said, in Dar es Salaam. And what they did was actually to change all German names, German street names to British street names. And of course, they did the same, that the names that were given to the streets were names of those British colonial officials. But of course, they retained some of the street names which were there before. So in Dar es Salaam alone, for example, in 1920, we had a total of 26 German streets with German names. And all of these, as we are going to see, they were renamed by the British colonial government. And the reasons are obvious. We are going to discuss the reasons why the British had to do that. In the entire country, by 1920, we had a total of 67 German streets. Of course, this was not the actual number of streets that we had in Dar es Salaam, but these were this figure is referring to the street names, I mean, streets that were changed by the British in 1920 alone. Now, this table here shows examples of streets that were renamed by the British. Like I said, we have a total of 46, but I won't display all of them. These are just examples. So for example, we have this street which was there in Dar es Salaam. We call it Kaiser Strasse. Now, during the British, they changed it to Main Avenue, and today they call it City Drive. And then you have Trotter Strasse, which was changed to Smart Street. We have Bismarck Strasse, which was changed to Versailles Street. And I'm yet to find the current name of the street today. We have Wiesmann Strasse, which was changed to Windsors Strasse. And then we have Barlow Strasse, which was changed to Stanley Street. And after independence, it was changed to Lumumba. Later on, they changed to Agrey, and finally they changed to Max-Weber Street. And then we have Johannes Strasse, which was changed to Ocean Road Street. And lucky that this one has remained as it is, and we have it today as Ocean Road Street. And then we have this other German street, unter dem Akazienstrasse, which the British name adopted the same name in English, Acacia Street. And at the time of independence, it was changed to Independence Avenue. Today they call it Uhuru Street. And then we have Eminstrasse, which was changed to Garden Avenue during the British time. And of course it was maintained, the name was maintained until independence, when it was changed to Hamburg Avenue. So, and of course, I'm going to explain why it was changed from Garden Avenue to Hamburg Avenue. Now, I'm trying to look at why these streets were changed by the British after they had attained Tanzania, or after they had got Tanzania as a mandate. The main reasons was to kind of to do away with German imperial legacy, which was reflected in the street names existing at that time. They had got Tanganyika, and the streets, all the streets were in German names, and these names were names of influential German officials. And the relations at the time could not allow the British to put up with these names, so they had to change for two major reasons: to change for the purpose of erasing German imperial legacy, and of course to change because they wanted to promote their imperial influence in Tanganyika, the country which they had just acquired. Now, how was this motive achieved? The government, the British government, what they did was, of course, to officially gazette, to change the names officially, and this event was gazetted, and the list of streets that were changed were listed, and they were, of course, published in this Gazette volume number 1, number 35 on 4th October 1920. But again, how that was achieved, I mean, if you ask how, for example, the change of names assisted in erasing German imperial legacy, if you look at the nature of the names that were given to these streets, you see that the British intention was, of course, to not only erase German imperial legacy, but also to kind of promote their own imperial influence in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam. And as you can see here, this example of this street, for example, from Trotta, Strasse to Smuts, all of these were military officers, and you can see that the intention of the British that to kind of maintain this imperial status which the Germans had already established in Tanganyika. And we have another example. This does not apply to Dar es Salaam, but at Bagamoyo, for example, which is some kilometers away from Dar es Salaam, you have a street which was changed from Kaiser to Queen, from Kaiser Strasse to Queen Strasse. So you can see that the intention here was to kind of to change, I mean, to erase German colonial imperial influence, but at the same time to promote British colonial influence. Now, so the names of the streets in Dar es Salaam were changed to different names of individuals. Some of them, of course, you know, they were not attached to the names of British officials. And then after independence, in 1961, the government inherited the streets of Dar es Salaam as they were in British colonial period. And what the government had to do was to change these street names. So roughly 2 months before independence, Dar es Salaam City Center, in collaboration with the then Independence Committee, changed 6 street names by order from the first president of Tanzania, that is the late Julius Kambarage Nyerere. So you can see that before even we got independence, because these people had already been assured that independence is just around the corner. So during the preparation for independence celebration, they had to do something about colonial legacy in terms of street names existing in Dar es Salaam by taking the first step of changing the six street names. We are going to see the names of these streets and of course discuss a little bit why that was the case. So I have these three examples here of the streets which are changed. We have, for example, this Acacian Avenue, which was, of course, the same, which had the same German name during German colonial period. Now, this one was changed to Independence Avenue, and today we call it Uhuru Street. And then we have this main avenue, or Kaiser Strasse. This was changed to City Drive. And then we have the new street, which was changed to Lumumba Street. And I would like you to note the first and the last one, the Acacian to Independence Avenue and the new street, so that we understand the discussion which follows. Now, if you ask why the government changed, the independent government changed the street names in Dar es Salaam, we have several reasons. The first one is the fact that it was because of the fact that they wanted to symbolize the change of the street names was to kind of symbolize the transfer of power, for example, as seen in the nature of the names of the streets that were given. The Independence Avenue, for example, it was the kind of saying, well, we are about to celebrate our independence, and then we are still having, we don't have anything which is, we have to do something to show the public that we don't want colonial system, and we have to do something to do away with the colonial street names. But the second one was to do away with the colonial street legacies. And this is the fact that, well, we are about to celebrate our independence, and then we still have streets that are mocking us. That means streets that are still in colonial names. So in order to show that we have really got independence and we are serious about our post-independence period, you have to do something about these streets, and something which, of course, continued. So the first point is, I call it, this is rather proximate cause in the sense that it was an immediate action by the government to change the street because of the celebrations that were ahead of the event of 1961. But the third one, which is very important, is the mounting pressure to change colonial names, which were degrading African people, as seen, for example, in editorials of the 1960s, in newspapers, for example. One of the factors as to why the government had changed the street names in the 1960s was because of this pressure from the people of Dar es Salaam that we should keep away with these colonial names. We should name these streets after our own people, or we should change them completely because colonialism, had already ended. So this was one of the factors to why this had to happen. But the other one is which is of course connected to this point, is to honor African nationalist leaders, colonial war heroes. Like, for example, we have Mkawa Street, Sam Nujoma Street, Mandela Street, we have Bibititi Street, and then we have Lumumba Street. So you get the idea that the changing of these streets was to kind of honor these people. Of course, Mkwawa was in Tanzania, but Sam Nujoma was from somewhere else. Mandela was from South Africa. Bibititi was a Tanzanian. Lumumba was from Congo. So the idea was Tanzania has got independence, and then it has to honor the colonial war heroes. And of course, because Tanzania was supporting liberation struggles in the southern part of Africa, that's why you see some of these names appearing here. But the last one is the fact that it was part of the city council to honor the city relationships existing between Dar es Salaam and the other cities. Of course, this is the recent force for change of street names in Dar es Salaam. And the good example here, we have this Garden Avenue, which was there. And in German times, to call Emin Strasse, this one was changed to Hamburg Avenue. The idea was to honor this sistership relationship existing between the city of Dar es Salaam and the city of Hamburg. And of course, it was a response from the effort that the Hamburg City Council did of, for example, having this Dar es Salaam Platz in Hamburg. So these are some of the forces that have been precipitated the change of these street names. Now this BBTT, this woman that I've talked about, she was very influential TANU nationalist leader, and she was very close with Nyerere during the struggle for independence. And the city of Dar es Salaam thought that a street has to be named after her name because of his contribution to independence struggles in Tanzania.
Excuse me, Reginald, excuse me.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Your presentation is so interesting, but let me please quickly remind you that you have like 3 minutes left. So
Okay.
I don't know how much is still coming, but maybe you can try to stay in time and then maybe leave something for the discussion, because I'm sure there will also be questions where you can.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
This is an example of the agitations which are there, and we had in Dar es Salaam in 1960 the Tiputipu street in Changombe, and you have people protesting against this street by this person I've just shown here. But also this spirit of agitating against colonial street names did not only involve streets, but also you have people who are still disappointed with these colonial names like colonial stores and imperial chemistry. And this is the photo of the Hamburg Avenue that I've talked about. That one is the same street, Hamburg Avenue. Now, as a conclusion, what we find is that in Tanzania, in comparison to other parts of the world, for example, in Europe, streets have, in Europe, we know that streets have two functions, the locative and the memory function. But one study has shown that in Tanzania, streets they are having this memory function. It's the very influential one, and that's why you have these agitations against colonial street names. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, this was really quick, but yeah, thank you very much for this interesting presentation. And now we will hear the presentation of Urs Lindner. Thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot for organizing this wonderful webinar. I'm really happy to be part of this conversation. And now I share my screen because I also have a PowerPoint. So yes, the title of my presentation is Multi-Directional Memory in Eastern Germany, the campaign to rename Erfurt's Nettelbeckufer. Let me first, and now it doesn't work, let me first start with some basics of the campaign. In March 2020, Decolonize Erfurt and the Initiative of Black People in Germany launched a campaign to rename Erfurt's Nettelbeckufer into Gerd-Schramm-Ufer. We've done quite a lot of things there, different formats. We had a petition, we organized rallies, we organized readings, we put glossy brochures into the post boxes of the residents. We made a scientific report on Nettelbeck. We had expert conversations. So there was also a huge media coverage, more than 50 reports in primarily local and regional media, mainstream media. There was some massive resistance from residents and also a counter campaign of the Alternative für Deutschland, which is the right-wing party, a neo-fascist party. we already had some success because Dortmund and Berlin have decided to rename their Nettelbeckstraße and their Nettelbeckplatz with reference to the Erfurt campaign. So what's next in Erfurt? We will have a roundtable with proponents and opponents of the renaming. So there are some specific difficulties for such a campaign in Eastern Germany. We have a right-wing cultural hegemony in Thuringia, and I would also say in Eastern Germany in general. Expect in some university cities like Weimar and Jena, we have a tiny Black and migrant communities. Also, we have the traumatic experience of massive scale street renaming after 1989. And of course, we have a continuity of national and racist identifications in the GDR, despite the official internationalism. Often this is related only to, for example, how contract laborers lived in the GDR. We had in Erfurt in 1975 a pogrom, racist pogrom against Algerian contract laborers. But I would argue, and this will show my presentation, that we have go back to what happened in the early 1950s in the GDR. And here's only one quote from Walter Ulbricht, who was the head of the party and the most important man in the GDR until 1971. He was also responsible for the Berlin Wall. I read it in German. Der nationale Befreiungskampf gegen die amerikanischen, englischen und französischen Okkupanten in Westdeutschland und für den Sturz ihrer Vasallenregierung in Bonn ist die Aufgabe aller friedliebenden und patriotischen Kräfte in Deutschland. So this quote could have been one-to-one from every ordinary neo-Nazi in Western Germany in the 1970s and 1980s. So, the title of my presentation is Multi-Directional Memory in Eastern Germany. This is so because we have a very interesting multi-directional street history in Erfurt. So with the concept of multi-directional memory, I of course refer to Michael Rothberg's approach. The central idea is that remembrance is no zero-sum game. And he extensively shows that and how the Holocaust, the memory of the Nazi crimes, and the memory of colonialism have historically reinforced each other. And one central idea is to forge what he calls differentiated solidarities between victim communities. So it's not about equating different crimes, but to relate them, to look for their commonalities without erasing their particularities. So as you know, there's currently a huge debate on this in Germany, also with respect to Dirk Moses. Polemics. My position on this is very simple. The Holocaust was not a colonial crime. It is unprecedented. At the same time, it took place in a context of colonial violence, which was the extermination war of the Wehrmacht against Poland and the Soviet Union. And of course, it's about taking into consideration this colonial context. And so it's not about relativizing the Holocaust, but about better understanding it. So this only as a conceptual remark on multi-directional memory. So to the history of the street in Erfurt, in 1905, a new street in Erfurt's north is named after Nettelbeck, Joachim Nettelbeck. He was a first mate on Dutch slavers. So first mate is Obersteuermann, Dutch slavers. Slavers are Versklavungsschiffe enslaving ships. It's quite, I was wondering for a long time, what is the relationship between the first mate and the captain on such a ship, and one can make an analogy if one compares such a, I'm not an expert in maritime history, but I think one can make the analogy if one compares such a ship to a German university. We have a president and a chancellor, so the president is like the captain and the first mate is like the chancellor. So Nettelbeck was involved into the transatlantic slave trade, and he also, in his autobiography, the description of this, his involvement is quite at the center. So it's one of the most important documents we have in German on German involvement into the transatlantic slave trade. He was also an advocate for the Prussian acquisition of colonies. He tried to convince 3 Prussian kings to acquire colonies, including plantation colonies in the Caribbean and an enslavement port in Western Africa. And the third thing, he was also a proto-fascist national hero of the anti-Napoleonic wars. So we have streets in other cities, for example, Bremen, Kiel, Hamburg, Köln as well. So I think you should consider whether you still want to honor this person. So the very interesting thing with Erfurt is that the Nettelbeckufer was renamed in 1950 into Gördeler Ufer. Karl Friedrich Gördeler was a main figure in the conservative resistance against Hitler, quite ambivalent figure. But the street was then renamed again in 1956 into Nettelbeckufer in the GDR. So how could this happen? There's a very interesting parallel to the University of Greifswald, because this university was named in 1933 after the anti-Napoleonic and nationalist, I would call him hate monger, Ernst Moritz Arndt. 1945, there was no name. 1954, it was renamed after Arndt, and then there was a long struggle for many years that the name, that there was again no name, and the university decided to get rid of its name in 2018. So, and the question is, when will the Nettelbeckufer be renamed into Gerd Schramm-Ufer? Only some brief information about Gerd Schramm. Gerd Schramm, I think there can be no reasonable disagreement about him. He was a black survivor of the concentration camp Buchenwald, whose parental ancestors have been enslaved to Cuba. He was the holder of the Federal Cross of Merit, and the most important thing, also he was born at Nettelbeck, at Erfurt's Nettelbeckufer. So with all 3 figures, we have a multi-directional history. So let me quickly give you some information about the hegemonic reception of Nettelbeck in Germany. There were 2 major readings in 19th and 20th century. Major reading was, he was the hero of Kolberg, of this defense of his hometown against Napoleon. Minor reading was a protagonist of the colonial idea. And it's very interesting that what is at the core of this first reading is something one could call authoritarian populism, defying the callous and defeatist military, the elites. Nettelbeck saved the Prussians' national honor by defending Kolberg against the French, and he integrated the people into a harmonious hierarchical relationship with the king. So at the beginning of 19th century, there were still, especially in restoration times, there were reservations against Nettelbeck. He became an undisputed national hero only after the German bourgeoisie had become a pillar of Prussia's authoritarian state. So he was also an important propaganda figure for the Nazis. And the interesting thing, and this is the explanation why the street was renamed into Nettelbeckufer in 1956, is that in the early 1950s there was a positive appropriation of the SED, the Socialist Unity Party in Eastern Germany, of the nationalism of the anti-Napoleonic War. So they equated Napoleon with the NATO. NATO identified themselves with true patriots like Nettelbeck and Gneisenau, who had forged a coalition with Tsarist Russia, which was for them the same as the Soviet Union, in order to liberate Germany from Western occupation. So this is clearly kind of crazy, but this was what happened in the 1950s in the GDR. And the most interesting thing is that all those readings rest on a suppression, on Verdrängung of Nettelbeck's involvement in transatlantic slave trade. So, for example, this is the Feldpost edition of the Wehrmacht, and it's an abbreviated version of the autography, and there's these 70 pages on Nettelbeck's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. They are not present there, they are erased. So I have 4 general reflections from our campaign. The first is finding a new eponym. How does this work? The compelling case for Gerd Schramm is an exception. I think in general, it's the best is a participatory selection process. I would say there are 5 strong eligibility criteria for the new eponym. The first is resistance against colonialism and or racism. The second is membership in a victim community. The third is connection with the place. The fourth is multi-directionality. And the fifth is not being male, because as we all know, there's an extreme overrepresentation of males in German street names. And if one thinks about Gerd Schramm fits the bill, the first 4 criteria perfectly, not the fifth. But in general, one could say it's the candidate is the better, the more criteria he fits, and it will be I think it will be nearly impossible to have a candidate who fills all the meets all the 5 criteria. So my second general reflection, in Erfurt's public debate, the main objection to the renaming campaign were slippery slope arguments. For example, Erfurt's mayor said, if we rename the Nettelbeckufer, then we have to rename 80% of our streets. And in fact, only 22% of Erfurt streets bear the names of human beings, so much to the quality of his argument. The basic form of slippery slope arguments is if A then Z, or a benign action. For example, the renaming of the Nettelbeckufer leads into a gray zone. There are no flawless eponyms, which is connected to a loss of control. Uncountable demands for renaming arise, and ending in a catastrophic state that there's a social cleavage of the city, hegemony of cancel culture. You all know these fear-monger projections. Only a comparison from German federal politics in 2015, conservative politician Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer launched the same kind of argument against same-sex marriages. If we legalize these kind of marriages, then we open the gates for incest and polygamy. You can read it. I checked it. She really said this in 2015. This kind of argument this is my conviction, can be refuted with regard to the gray zone, the loss of control claim, and the catastrophic outcome claim. I think in renaming context, the most important is to refute the gray zone, and the argument would be Nettelbeck was a qualitatively different case from, for example, Wilhelm Kötz or Konrad Adenauer, who have been also involved in German colonialism or colonial revisionism in the case of Adenauer. So the conclusion would be renaming streets should these campaigns should focus on cases that are clear. Of course, what is clear depends on your perspective, but clear means the result of an all things considered evaluation of the biography of the current name giver. And I think in Nettelbeck's case, it's clear what clear means. So my third reflection, the role of public administrations, and this connects very well to the first panel this morning. Erfurt's mayor being against the renaming of the Nettelbeckufer, the city administration has taken up the stance that it supports the decolonization process of the city on the one hand, but that the Nettelbeckufer is too controversial to take a stance. After pressure from political parties, the administration now understands its role as moderating the controversy between proponents and opponents. And of course, the central issue, we have seen how it raised already in the first panel, is can a city administration be neutral towards its own street names? What about a commitment to democratic values, dignity, equality, that also cover the naming of streets? So this is the central question. I only want to pose it. Perhaps we can discuss about it. Perhaps there will be in the chat some comments on this. And of course, much with the Nettelbeckufer, much has to do with the local social democracy, for example. Thuringia's social democracy has declared to support decolonial street renaming initiatives. Part of Erfurt's social democracy, including the mayor, do not care about this. In Dortmund, the renaming was against the Social Democrats. In Berlin, they were the driving force. So I come to my final reflection, a question we have not yet raised in our webinar. At the first glance, it might sound banal, but it is clearly not. When are street names colonial? For example, Verena Ebert, she's a linguist. In her dissertation, she argues street names are only colonial if there has been an intention with the naming to honor colonialism. So according to her, amongst the 30 instances in Germany of Nettelbeck streets, only Munich's Nettelbeck Street, named after Nettelbeck in 1932, is colonial in character. Her main tools to uncover colonialist intentions, its nearby street names and descriptions in address books. I think this procedure is already highly problematic because in the end you can be sure about what the intention was only if you have documents about the process, the decision-making process in the local parliament and in its assemblies. So as long as you do not have this, I would say, this kind of descriptions in address books are simply not sufficient. But even if this procedure would be valid, the intentions based on the Kohlberg myth still rest, as we have seen, upon a suppression of Nettelbeck's involvement in transatlantic slavery. And the conclusion is there is no escape from current meanings and normative standards. So to look for intentions may be in some respects even misleading, because if you later detect that someone has been an anti-Semite, so the intentions might be completely different, but nevertheless, it's a strong reason to rename the street. I want to give you an analogy. So discrimination is not about the intentions of the discriminator, but about the objective meaning of an act or a rule and its harmful consequences of the victims. And now let me conclude with the basic multi-directionality of the campaign. So challenging Nettelbeck's involvement in the transatlantic slavery has led the Erfurt campaign to uncover and reevaluate the proto-fascism, authoritarian populism of the Kolberg myth and its appropriation by the late Stalinist Socialist Unity Party in the GDR. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much for your presentation. This was also very interesting, and I'm sure we will have a lot to discuss. And yes, now I'd like to give the word to Kim Todzi for our third presentation.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you for the invitation and for organizing this panel, and I'm really delighted to join this conversation with so great colleagues of mine. Just one short organizational remark from my side. I have to apologize right at the very beginning, as I will not be able to stay until the end of the discussion. My little son has to stay at home, and I could only organize an alternative care until 1 p.m. So excuse me if I have to rush after my presentation. But I will start to try to share my screen now, and hopefully it will work. I think now you can see it. I thought about trying to tie in with some of the thoughts the other panelists already give. Maybe we will have some time at the end of the presentation. I try to keep it as short as possible now. The historian Karl Schlögl famously said, "The history of names is always also the history of power." And I think it is important to remind ourselves that names of streets and places in a city are not neutral. They are not only a memory of the city, as Rita Barke has framed it, but they reflect who had the power to shape and name the cityscape. This is precisely why, in a pluralistic and participatory democracy, the question arises as to how one wants to deal with these street names. But I think before we should talk about how to do that in the future, let's look at how we got here in the first place. In my talk, I will define two major categories of colonial street names. And then I will distinguish 4 phases of colonial street naming practices in Hamburg. And finally, I call for binding criteria and a systematic reappraisal of street names related to National Socialism, colonialism, and group-based enmity by street name commissions in a joint process. The question of how colonial street names are dealt with in Hamburg and beyond encourages reflection on what colonial street names are in the first place. And Urs has had some remarks on that, and I think it's very important to think about what kind of categories fall into colonial street names. Of course, we can roughly distinguish 2 main types of colonial street names. First, those that are intentional homages to colonialism and are named after colonies or colonial actors. And second, those that honor people, events, or places that are somehow related to colonialism. There's a tendency, as Urs has pointed out, by some scholars to regard only those of category 1 as colonial street names, names that were given with the intention of honoring colonialism. However, I've seen that on Urs' side as well, argue for a broader definition of colonial street names that include the second category as well. After all, colonialism did not only shape Hamburg's landscape through historical, political interventions and street names that intend to honor the German colonial empire, which, however, I think should undoubtedly also be an important point of assessment. It is actually the case that the entire topography of cities and villages all across Europe was shaped by the colonial globalization, by the global interconnections first established by European expansion, global slavery, and imperialism. The extent to which these categories were inscribed into the cityscape at different historical phases is what I would like to show in the following by a periodization. In Hamburg, we can roughly distinguish 4 partly overlapping phases of street naming. The first phase is what I call global colonial entanglements. It begins in the early modern period and extends to the end of the former German colonial empire in 1919. This phase is dominated by the second category, that is, by streets being named after people who were in one way or another successful merchants, traders, industrialists who profited from colonial globalization. One of these names, I just have a few examples to explain my point. One of these names is the Stockmeyer Strasse, named 1854 after Heinrich Christian Meyer's factory, which was from 1836 located at this street on the Grasbrook in Hamburg. Meyer himself, who is described and honored as one of the first industrialists in Hamburg, used almost exclusively raw materials such as rattan, which came from Dutch or British colonies in what is now Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, to produce walking sticks industrially in Hamburg. Meyer and his successors not only profited from colonial globalization, but also helped set colonial industrialization in Hamburg in motion. What can be clearly seen in this period, even after the founding of the former German colonial empire, is that the references of colonial street names were a matter of Hamburg's self-description as a trading and transnational entangled port city. Most of the streets were not named to honor formal colonial rule. Rather, it was about Hamburg merchants wanting to represent themselves as successful businessmen, which has been decisively shaped by the colonial globalization. This changed fundamentally with the loss of the German colonies. After the loss of the colonies as a result of the First World War, a new phase began, which is dominated by colonial revisionism, which lasted from the early 1920s to 1945. In this phase, we see a peak of streets named of category 1 related to the German Empire in Hamburg. A cluster of colonial street names emerged from the mid-1920s onwards in the port of Hamburg on the Kleiner Grasbrook. A renaming was to take place in the harbor that would be suited to, quote, keep alive the memory of the African colonies stolen from Germany. The former Petroleumhafen was renamed Südwesthafen, named after the former colony Deutsch Südwestafrika, nowadays Namibia. The previously unnamed cays were given the name Togo Kai, Windhoek Kai, and Cameroon Kai. This commemorative naming practice in the harbor, which was the gateway between the German Empire and its colonies, reflects a colonial revisionist process of appropriation of space. Meanwhile, in the Horn district of Hamburg, on the border with Wandsbek, between Horner Rennbahn and Raueshaus, another colonial cluster emerged from 1929 onwards. It was a district whose, quote, streets were named after colonial Germans, unquote. A total of 8 street names referred to the history of German colonialism by being named after more or less prominent German colonial actors. The neighborhood was the largest contiguous colonial cluster in Hamburg until it was converted into an allotment area right next to the corner Kreisel. And on the right side, you see the area nowadays. Only the Theodor Weber-Reihe and the Oswaldstraße has been preserved to this day. The other streets were restructured or renamed or erased in the course of the reconstruction of the district after World War II. The naming of the streets in the colonial cluster in Horn and the port facilities echoed a discourse that was meant to render the loss of the colonies as an injustice and at the same time commemorate the achievements of German colonialists. With the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany had lost its colonies, which the League of Nations has handed over to the victorious powers as mandated territories. Accusations that the Germans were incapable of colonizing served as justification for taking away the colonies. The revisionism of the colonial movement, which grew stronger in the Weimar Republic, was directed against the so-called Kolonialschuldlüge, the colonial guilt lie. Under National Socialism, the colonial movement in Hamburg grew ever stronger, and the demand for the restoration of former colonial possessions was articulated more strongly. In the district of Wandsbek, an extensive list of suggested names emerged at the end of 1938 that explicitly referred to the past German colonial empire. Their renaming was only prevented by the beginning of the Second World War. With the dissolution of the National Socialist Colonial Office in 1943 and the collapse of the German Reich in 1945 at the latest, the demand of regaining the former German colonies disappeared from public discourse. However, existing colonial street names were not renamed, and the colonial monuments also remained in place for the time being. Meanwhile, the largest corpus of colonial street names was given after 1945 in a third phase I call colonial nostalgia and amnesia. Attempting to rename some of the National Socialist street names, the initiators often resorted to historical legacy that was considered uncritical or even positive at the time, namely that of overseas relations of Hamburg as a port city. After 1945, names such as Nöltingstraße, Wörmannstieg, Schimmelmannstieg, and Kaiserstrasse referred to merchants and entrepreneurs from Hamburg. They were regarded as pioneers of trade with non-European territories. Their economic success and their philanthropic achievements seemed reason enough to assign them an honorable place in the memory of the city and to tie in with a seemingly unencumbered tradition that had not been compromised by National Socialists. Well into the Federal Republic of Germany, a narrative persisted that glorified the activities of Hamburg merchants as honorable merchants who did not succeed through the reprehensible enslavement trade, but even suppressed it with legitimate trade. Thus, Hamburg merchants were constructed as important figures in the civilization of supposedly uncivilized people. This naming practice is directly connected to the first phase of global colonial entanglements and thus established a direct continuity that appeared as seemingly uncontaminated by National Socialism. Now, these names were joined by street names that referred to colonial heroes, but avoided this discourse. For example, in 1950, a street was named Wismannstraße, which was primarily dedicated to the African explorer, Hermann von Wismann, not to the colonial officer or first governor of the colony Deutsch Ostafrika. Colonial amnesia, as well as glorifying nostalgic discourses, remained active until our own time. For example, in the Hafen City, which was only built in the 2000s, there are numerous streets and place names that uphold these colonial nostalgic discourses, such as the Vasco da Gama Platz, named in 2005, the Columbus House built in 2002, or the Americo Vespucci Platz, named in 2013.
I'm sorry, I don't want to be rude, but I just wanted to remind you that you have like 3 minutes left.
Yeah,
so
I'm quite at the end. Okay, while the, oh, sorry, I'm right there and I'm right here at the end because I think while colonial nostalgia was making a big comeback in Hamburg, critical reflections did so as well. And I think affirmative remembrance is gradually giving way to critical identity reflection. And I think this workshop is part of this new process. But I have to, I think I have to plea for some things. I think it is important not only to see who or what is honored in each specific case, but also to look at the naming context. Because should it be agreed, for example, to rename only streets named after people, the largest colonial cluster in the harbor in the Südwesthafen, which was meant to inscribe colonial revisionism into the cityscape, will remain untouched. And this, I think, is important to remind ourselves that we have there is a need for binding and unambiguous assessment criteria of street names. And I would like to make a plea for a systematic review of all street names on the basis of historical, ethical, and political standards with regard to National Socialism, colonialism, and group-based enmity. Because from my point of view, it seems highly questionable to completely separate the reappraisal of Nazi-incriminated street names, which is already on the way, from the reappraisal of colonial street names. Not only because some of the colonial street names can be directly and indirectly traced back to Nazi rule. Rather, the evaluation and the inclusion of different academic and civil society perspectives in this process should not run separately from each other, but relate to each other and inform each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you to all three of us. This was very interesting. And yeah, I will now open up the discussion so that we have still some 20 minutes left for this. Please, everyone in the audience, please type your questions in the chat. And we already have some questions here, so I will just start if that's all right for you. Okay. So the first question, okay. So the first question goes to Reginald, Kirey. It's posed by Anke Schwarzer, and it says, thank you very much for your presentation. And the question is, are there currently any grassroots or NGO activities in Dar es Salaam? Or also maybe in other Tanzanian cities that aim to name or to rename street names, for example, after female role models and important resistance fighters. We can't hear you. You need to switch on again the microphone, please.
Thank you very much for that very important question. Of course, at the moment, we don't have specific groups or, like organized groups of people who are looking into these issues. But in most cases, the city councils are the ones who handle issues of names. But you have a kind of disorganized discussions among the community concerning street names and, of course, even names of the important historical sites. They are not as organized as it is in your case, for example. But so you don't find a specific group, organized to look into these issues of streets. And I think the main reasons is because issues of memory in these our countries, they are not as advanced or as pronounced as they are in the West. But of course, in most of these African countries, reflections are there, and people are asking questions about some of these legacies, and you can see the discussions from newspapers, for example, especially newspapers. You have people who are trying to talk of the street names and place names, and of these colonial legacies, and some of them would argue against some of the legacies which are degrading African people. So that's what I would say.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I have another one for Reginald Kirey for you. The second question says, how do people today feel about the Hamburg Avenue? Because it's a German city. So yeah, how do they feel about this connection?
Yeah, this Hamburg Avenue, like I said, it was established after the establishment of the Dar es Salaam Hamburg sistership. And the idea of having it is the fact that because in German we have a place named after, Dar es Salaam Platz, and they thought that to kind of strengthen the relationship it's there, and as a sign of friendship, they have to name at least a street by this Hamburg. And of course, it's a very small city, and very, for example, last week I posted this one and people were surprised. Most people did not know that we have Hamburg Avenue in Dar es Salaam. So it's not very much public. Very few people know about it. And of course, there are no much discussions about that, except for other colonial sites, like, for example, the Star Monument and some other places. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, but I think it's really interesting because in the case of Dar es Salaam, it was really the city government or the state officials that took action to rename the streets, to shift power, as you said, and also to honor freedom fighters and
Yes.
people from the resistance. While in
Yes.
Germany, the initiative is, as far as I know, in any city, it always comes from groups, from decolonized groups, like or from the ESD, so more from the ground, and then it's a process with the city governments. That's also not always easy.
Yeah, and of course it's not only the Hamburg Avenue. We also have streets in our countries, especially in Dar es Salaam, which are named after countries. Like, for example, we have Morocco Street in Dar es Salaam. And if you ask why this Morocco Street, you have a lot of things people talk about and all that. And maybe the thing is, most of these streets acquire their names naturally in most cases. So you find a street, you have an influential person living there, or you have an event which happened and which relates to this name, and the street will just automatically acquire the name. So that's what it is. Yeah.
Okay. So now I have a question for Urs Lindner, and the question is: are there any memory institutions supporting the post-colonial decolonized activity to remember the Nettelbeckufer? And do you think that it would be beneficial if archives, museums, and institutions like that would help would help or to participate in pushing for renaming?
Thanks a lot for this question. We have indeed some support, for example, by the memory place Gedenkstätte Buchenwald, the director, Jens Christian Wagner. He's a strong supporter of our campaign. The most important memory place in Erfurt also supports the campaign. It's the Erinnerungsort Topf und Söhne. It's a memory place commemorating the factory who have created the ovens for Auschwitz. And also the director of Erfurt's arts museums strongly support the campaign. So we have a relatively strong support in civil society and in local memory institutions. This is wonderful, but there could be, of course, more, especially in a more regional and more on the federal level. We would be very happy for this, and I think there could be, after Dortmund and Berlin have renamed their Nettelbeck streets, there could be some concerted effort from other cities to push through renamings in other places. So if someone is interested in this, I'm very happy if you contact me. One remark about the archive, the city archive in Erfurt, the director is against the renaming because she thinks that the Nettelbeckufer should be renamed into Gödeleufer, which to my opinion, shows that she clearly has not understood what is at issue, what coming to terms with Germany's colonial past. But even this is kind of progress, because in the 1990s, Erfurt got a memorial for deserters from the Wehrmacht. And at this time, the director of the city archive, he was one of the main public proponents, and he simply said, okay, deserters from the Wehrmacht, they do not deserve to be honored because they were cowards. And so there's kind of progress from this post-fascist attitude in the 1990s to what's going on now. Sorry for this long reply.
No, it's fine. I also have a comment to your answer by Tanya Ba, and she says, thank you for your answer. It's great to see in Hamburg there are so few institutions actually taking a stance publicly. Something we should be working on. Would you agree, Kim? Could you switch your microphone on, please?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I haven't. Sorry, I'm still trying to take care of my son. Sorry, can you repeat the question?
No worries, sorry. It's just that it's a comment to the answer from Urs Lindner, and it says, thank you for this answer. It's great to see in Hamburg there are so few institutions actually taking a stance publicly. Something we should be working on. Would you agree?
On not taking stance, but well, yeah, I think we have a strong citywide commitment to post-colonial, to coming to terms with the colonial legacy, and I think many institutions are waiting, waiting for something happening on the side of the city, a post-colonial citywide memory concept, which should be applied to these institutions. But yeah, I think I would very appreciate it if more institutions were more vocal about it.
I see. Thank you. Sorry. It's yes, I have another question from Millicent Ajay, and it's to all three of you actually. It says, how can all your works be gathered to inform the city society? Because all these street names are also spread in Germany. So yeah.
If I may, we have a website, where you can get information of our activities, and especially a Facebook account. Everyone is invited to like it. So we try to make all what we do public and transparent.
Sorry, you're still muted, Bebero.
Okay. Does any? Sorry, sometimes it's difficult to do these things at home. I also have kids But does anybody want to add something to what was just said, or should we go on with the questions?
Well, I can quickly jump in. I think that's a very important point. And that's exactly why I think it's important to have a systematic approach to these streets, not only that you always have singular cases, but to try to really gather all the information together and then decide on which criteria should be applied and how we can inform the discussion much more broadly. And I think that is a very major step towards a more democratic and participatory cityscape.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so Reginald, you don't want to add anything to this? Yeah. Then if not, I can go on with the next questions. But if you would like to add something to this, please do it. Okay. Sometimes the questions are very long, so let me quickly read through this. Okay, it's also a question. It asks, what is the standard procedure currently to renaming or to naming? Oh no, okay. What is the current procedure to name streets in Hamburg is the question. Maybe this takes us a bit far away from because it's rather a technical question. And then I also have a comment from whom, I don't know from whom, from somebody, that it's surprising like how to define colonial street names, and if it's colonial only if the intention is absolutely clear to honor colonialism, or if we have this connection, and this depending on which definition you choose, of course, it's a different discussion. And the question is this really an opinion we have to take serious or deal with? Or do we all agree on a broader definition of colonial street names? I think, yeah. Yes, please.
So I think
you can, yes.
Okay, sorry. Perhaps Kim?
Go ahead.
Okay, I think it's not about what we agree upon, but it's about what's in the public conversation. And this kind of argument is part of the public conversation. In Erfurt, our beloved mayor, he said, okay, the Nettelbeckufer was not named after Nettelbeck for his engagement in transatlantic slave trade, but for defending Kolberg. And so he argued with the intention. And then, of course, we have to face and confront and refute this kind of thinking, as long as it is in the conversation. There are many, to my understanding, absurd arguments against renamings. For example, one prominent argument is also by our mayor. He said, okay, historical persons have to be evaluated according to the standards of their time, he meant dominant standards. So it's also an absurd argument, but we have to deal with it in the public debate.
Yes, I agree. I also think it's an absurd argument, but of course, one has to deal with it, especially if this argument comes from the city mayor. And yeah, this is important in the process of renaming.
If I may just quickly jump into that. And I mean, that is exactly why I think it's important to not look only at colonial street names, but to look at street names in general related to National Socialism, colonialism, and group-based enmity. Because put this argument forward in a National Socialist discourse, how was one person see, or the moral values that was seen at a time? It wouldn't work that way. You wouldn't argue that way in other discussions, and that's why I think we have to agree on the criteria how to to decide which street names should be replaced or not. And I think it's very important to think about these in broader terms, with relation to colonialism, but not only. And the other thing is, if the opinion should be taken seriously, of course it should be taken seriously. It's one of the major publications on colonial street names in Germany, and it's very much in the discourse right now. And I think we have to tackle these arguments. I think it's just important to remind ourselves we can go way further than this definition. But I think I have to. I have another visitor now, and I might now have to maybe leave the discussion now. So
okay.
Thank you very much. And
thank you very much
bye-bye.
for your time. And yes, so to conclude, we have to deal with these kind of arguments, but at the same time, we also should not forget, I think, and this is also comment in the chat by Hani-Marie Jokinen, who is very involved and active at Hamburg Post-Colonial for a very long time. And it says that especially BIPOC communities were very active in the last 20 years to decolonize urban spaces in Hamburg. And I'd say not just in Hamburg, but also in a lot of other cities. And I think their definitions of colonial street names and their expertise also counts a lot. And this is also, I think, a striking argument why definitions of colonial street names, like the mayor of Erfurt tried to do, or they do not work, and they could not just be the standard, but have to really be challenged and tackled and overcome. So yeah, we're unfortunately running out of time. I see there's still coming in some more questions, but yeah, our panel is also officially over already, and I'd like to maybe take just a few more minutes to sum it up a bit. So what did we learn today from these three presentations to deal with colonial street names in cities? And maybe not just with street names, but because this was also very important, very interesting, I think, in the presentation of Kim Todzi, that he also looked at areas like the harbor area and not just at street names. And so I think we learned, especially also from Reginald Kirey's presentation, that renaming street names is really meaningful, or can be really meaningful, as an act of decolonizing, as an act of regaining power. It can also be an empowerment act for, I also think of the case of Germany then, for marginalized groups, if we no longer honor colonizers, but rather switch the perspective and tell the history from okay. Okay, now everybody is out.
Yeah, I think they are just smaller. I think you can continue. They are just smaller. They are still there.
Okay, because I don't see anybody anymore. So then in the case of Germany, we just learned that the multi-directional memory approach is very important, and that it can be very beneficial to not just deal with colonial street names and then street names from the context of the National Socialism separately, but together, because of course also in history it wasn't just National Socialism and then before something totally different like colonialism, but we have these entanglements, so it just makes sense also to deal with the street names together. and that this is also, I think, a very important point, that we should have categories on how to rename, like after whom do we rename? Do we rename after places or people? And this is the point that Lindner made, but this is also something that we learned from Reginald Kirey's presentation, that it's really a question: do we rename after a place, or do we rename after a person, for example, a freedom fighter? And so we need a systematic approach. And then, of course, who plays a crucial role in renaming or in dealing with street names and deciding whether to rename and how to rename. It's, of course, the city administrations are very important, but also grassroots organizations and people from marginalized communities to decide then which names should be taken and how. And I also found it very interesting that it's also really a question of how committed are we to our democratic values. And in all three cases, in the case of Dar es Salaam and also in the case of Hamburg and Erfurt, I think it all comes up to these two questions: who do we still want to honor, and from which perspective do we want to remember our history? So this is my conclusion. Does anybody want to add something to it? Urs and Reginald?
Yeah, it has been a very quite good discussions, and I think we have learned a lot. The kind of processes that are there and things that are happening, the movements that are taking place in different parts of the world concerning these issues. And I think this is something which has to find more time to discuss and to research on. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I also would have loved to have more time to discuss this, but thank you very much again for your presentations and for this discussion. I also learned a lot, actually. And yes, so thank you for your time. And also thank you to the audience for all these questions and for participating. And I wish you all a wonderful rest of the day.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Bebero, for facilitating this panel, for summarizing in the end. And thank you to the panelists for sharing your knowledge and research. That was very interesting. And also thank you once again to the audience. I know there are many questions and comments. We can't take all of them into the discussion here, but I want to assure you that we save everything, and all the questions you raise are important for us in continuing our work. So please don't worry, we will keep your questions in mind. We have our lunch break now, and we continue here at 2 p.m. With the third panel of this day with 3 activists talking about their experience in struggling for renaming colonial street names in Germany. Today we will keep this meeting open. Yesterday we had to close it and open again after lunch, but today we found a technical solution to keep it open. So yeah, I see you here at 2 p.m.